Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to welcome you all. As Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leicester, I would very much like to have joined the panel, but it has coincided with a meeting of the University Council, who are my bosses, so I hope you will excuse my absence. The prestigious Scarman Lecture series has a proud record with many distinguished speakers since 2008. And I'm delighted to welcome to the event the Right Honourable David Lammy, Member of Parliament for Tottenham, Ian Hopkins, Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, and our experts academic panel. I'm proud to be associated with this event because of my own passion for equality, diversity and inclusion, and zero tolerance toward racism and hate. The subject of this year's lecture, Policing, Race and Criminology in the UK, speaks to my own commitment to create a fairer and more just society. I want Leicester to set the standard in the UK and beyond for inclusion in higher education. We have set ambitious targets for the university to achieve by 2025. Leadership comes from the top and by empowering others to be change makers. Together, we're working to make this university a flag bearer for diversity and inclusivity. In doing so, we're tackling the barriers that exist, which is pertinent to your discussions as you explore issues of structural racism and the challenges these create for institutions and individuals to bring about a fairer processes and experience with the criminal justice system. This event is an opportunity for a timely public-facing discussion between experts, professionals, and criminologists about policing, race, and criminology in the UK in 2020. Using digital solutions, we have the opportunity of producing knowledge in conversation with others in ways we hope we can spark new thoughts and answers, and continue these conversations and networks beyond this event. I would like to thank our main speaker, David Lammy, again. I'm aware of the importance of his Lammy Review in informing your discussions. And I also thank Mr. Ian Hopkins for providing with the police perspective. My appreciation too for our expert discussants, Dr. Suzella Palmer and Dr. Martin Glynn, as well as our own School of Criminology for organizing this event. And of course, to our online audience. I hope you have a very successful event. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to this evening's event. My name is Henrietta O'Connor. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Social Science, Arts and Humanities. It's an absolute pleasure and an honour to be asked here this evening. The Scarman Lecture is a highlight in our calendar of events, and this year is no exception. The team have done an incredible job in ensuring that the annual lecture goes ahead. And although we're all missing the opportunity to attend live events at the moment, there's a lot to be said for the inclusiveness of virtual events. This has enabled us this evening to welcome a huge audience of way over 1,000 attendees. In fact, I think we've reached 1,500 attendees, so our reach is huge. Welcome to you all. My role this evening is to introduce our keynote speaker, who in reality needs little introduction, as he's already known to all of you and is a regular on our TV screens. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, the Right Honourable David Lammy, Member of Parliament for Tottenham, Shadow Lord Chancellor and Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. I'm now going to hand over to Dylan, who will begin by posing David an opening question.
David, so for our first question, we wanted to touch on the theme structural racism, society and policing. As noted in the Lammy Review, many of the causes of BAME overrepresentation in the criminal justice system lie outside the criminal justice system, as do the answers to it. Could you explain a little more how long-standing structural inequalities in the context of things like race and class impact the experiences of individuals with the criminal justice, perhaps in the context of social problems like poverty or differential punishment in schools and youth justice systems, or difficulties in social mobility?
Well, look, thank you very much, Dylan. It's great to join you, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm very pleased to at least virtually make a contribution to the Scarman Lecture this year. Look, I think that the starting point for this is to step back and remember that in its entirety, what we are talking about is how we as human beings, as groups and in societies, and for these purposes we're talking about nations as a unit of society rather than localities or even regions, how we deal with offending behaviour. And when we think about offending behaviour, i.e. behaviours that society deems are inappropriate, harmful, criminal, detrimental, it's important to understand that it is always the case that you can deal with offending behaviour in different ways. So, for example, what I found when I went to Australia is alcohol accounts for a significant proportion of Indigenous Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system in Australia. In fact, a significant amount of those who spend time incarcerated are there literally because they have been found drinking in public. Now, Australia could choose to deal with that offending behaviour, because it may be that in Australian mores to be drinking, or indeed even to be drunk in public, is offensive. Australia could choose to deal with that through the health system. But Australia chooses to deal with that through the criminal justice system very largely. And surprise, surprise, the group that finds itself caught up in alcohol is Indigenous people. And that is for very, very deep historical reasons that your students can explore further. And therefore, Australia has deemed that a criminal activity and not something that requires a health response. And you can see that across all societies in the world. Back in our own society, then, before you even get to me asking the fundamental question about disproportionality in the justice system and the wheels of the justice system and how they work, from policing through to the Crown Prosecution Service, through to the courts, through to the prisons, is to understand what may be the drivers of that, the pipeline issues in broader society, and that takes you back to some fundamental areas that exist in most societies, in fact. So clearly it takes you back to poverty. Clearly, in the context of our own country, the last decade has marked austerity. Clearly there has been a lot of work done in societies like the UK, where we know that inequalities are bigger than really at any point certainly in the latter part of the 20th century. That is the gap between those who have and those who do not, the gap between what I would describe as the asset class, those who own homes, bought their homes decades ago and therefore have relative wealth, and those who don't, the gap between those who rely on benefit system or are unemployed or are on low income jobs and 0-hour contracts, and those who are not. Those gaps have grown in society, and it's into that mix that you get these pipeline of issues that lead to offending behaviours, or society deems offending behaviours, and those offending behaviours, society says, look, let's pick those up with the criminal justice system. So let's break down some of those. school exclusions is a very good one. Who gets excluded from schools? What is the policy context for school exclusions? There are probably two big drivers of the current school exclusion situation. One is government policy that's led to massive plurality amongst schools and huge school autonomy, which simply put is academy schools, free schools, devolved of the responsibility that schools traditionally had to local authorities and therefore to democratic accountability. So that's one driver. The second driver is rising standards, school inspection regime, and therefore pressure in schools to what they call off-roll kids, children underperforming, to sort of get them off the register so they don't show up in the grades, or indeed to exclude pupils entirety. And those drivers, academy, free schools, not really being accountable in the same way and therefore being able to exclude in larger ways, a driver to want to present your school as excellent and brilliant and the grades are all wonderful by getting rid of pupils who are not presenting as or doing as well, and indeed the problems that we have in society with young people with special educational needs, and the lack of support for those young people means, surprise, surprise, that a lot of black young people are excluded from schools if they have special educational needs, actually relatively mild ones like dyslexia, dyspraxia, they are ADHD, they are excluded in droves, and they then turn up once they're excluded and never get back into mainstream school. Remembering that in Britain you can be excluded from school as young as 6, 7, primary age. You'll basically can find yourself in a pipeline to young offenders institutions. Often kids very young are not actually going to their pupil referral units, and there's a pipeline that leads to criminality. And obviously I could also talk about what happens if we know that 50% of young boys growing up in London are growing up above the 4th floor, i.e. they are growing up in our housing estates and developments. We also know, don't we, that the collapse of neighbourhood policing in Britain, i.e. that if you ring 999, the police will show up, but that sort of neighbourhood, everyday police who got to know the community, sat within the community, and therefore could deal with low-level crime and the trust of the community, that has gone, and it has gone under austerity. All those budgets have been cut. We've lost 21,000 police officers. They were all neighbourhood police officers. They've all disappeared. And because of that context, which are the areas where that is at its most acute? Surprise, surprise, our housing estates. Surprise, surprise, no police. And what happens? The gangsters, the drug dealers, the groomers start to take control. Kids fear or have to make choices. Do I join the gang, or do I sort of try and make it on my own because the police aren't going to help me? And surprise, surprise, again, you get a pipeline into the criminal justice system because offending behaviour grows as a result, frankly, of the social environment in which people are at. I could also mention, pernicious inequalities that exist within the criminal justice system, but I'll perhaps touch on that on my next question. But it's to say that austerity does have an effect, because if you cut youth services, if you cut neighbourhood policing, if you cut local authorities funding by 54%, if you're excluding young people, look at the young people in care. Look what happens. I mean, looked after young people, which is how we describe young people in the care system, is one of the biggest oxymorons in the British language. They're not looked after is the point. We've got young people often in care homes miles and miles and miles from where they grow up. So what do? They leave the care home, they come back to their communities, they're then arrested, they get angry or they have emotional difficulties, they smash up some furniture, and then they get into criminal damage and they get arrested. It's a pipeline, isn't it? The care system, again, who gets adopted in Britain, who gets proper foster care in Britain. I'm afraid the proportion of black children languishing in the care system is higher than other communities. And again, another pipeline into the criminal justice system. I hope I've done your question credit, Dylan.
Fantastic response, David. No, very, very, very insightful in terms of the way that, you know, structures shape people's opportunities in their treatments and the social environment. It leads quite nicely to the second question that we wanted to touch on, which is this relationship between those structures and maybe institutional prejudice. So going back to the data in the Lammy Review, it provided a lot of evidence about this inequity and the disproportionality in figures around policing, such things as stop and search, arrests, sentencing, the youth justice system and more. And you did a really nice job of illustrating the relationship between sort of structural issues and the pipeline, or the sort of development of institutional prejudice. Thinking about policing specifically, the Lammy Review found a clear direct association between ethnic group and the odds of receiving a custodial sentence. And we've also seen examples in the increases recently in the use of Section 60 orders, despite crime levels falling. So I wanted to ask you, in the light of the Lammy Review and what you found out, what sorts of cautions or concerns might you have for policing today and the relationship between the police and local communities who are disproportionately targeted?
Well, look, I am a big believer in neighbourhood policing. I think that policing is at its best when police genuinely reflect society, genuinely reflect localities and communities, and generally build relationships with those communities. And of course, the challenge in our model of policing is that police don't reflect the society. Remember, 1% of police officers nationally in Britain are black. 1%. It's obviously slightly higher here in London, but it's nothing like the proportion in London of 40% of the population being from an ethnic minority background. We've historically had challenges with police applying to be police officer here in a city like London, or indeed in a city like Leicester or Birmingham, actually coming from and living and growing up in very, very different parts of the country. And therefore their relationship with those communities can be problematic. Now, the rules have changed here in London, but they've been relaxed for coronavirus. The other thing that can happen, by the way, is if you then have big jumps in policy, and we did have in policing. So we got rid of 21,000 police officers. We shut down neighbourhood policing offices across the country. All of us can see the old police station vanished, gone. What happens is you then get, as is happening now, we've gone back to recruiting the officers that we lost, but we've lost a sort of memory, we lost a sort of relationship. We now have new officers, younger officers coming into the force with their own stereotypes and their own prejudices and their own fears, indeed, in relation to black communities. And then you have the vexed issue of stop and search. This is an issue, a global issue. It's called carding in Canada. It's often referred to as stop and frisk in the United States, but it's the same issue, and that is black communities feeling over-policed. It is, of course, the case that there is a problem with gang crime. There is a problem with knife crime. There's a problem with gun crime in communities as we speak, and certainly it's the case that many black communities are serious victims of crime. But we have to ask big, deep questions about how you deal with that, and the vast majority of public policy is aimed at the young black child being pimped and running county lines, but by the way, which is not that different to Charles Dickens writing about this in Oliver Twist, and Fagin pimping young people. So this has been going on for a very, very long time indeed, when actually government could be asking far bigger questions, not just the basis of the questions you were asking at the beginning, which is about inequalities, poverty, austerity, the pipeline like school exclusion or young people in care. But actually, for example, in relation to knife crime and gang activity, what is the central issue? Well, the central issue is drugs. That's what really is driving gang and knife crime. Tons and tons of cocaine, and the UK being one of the major cocaine capitals of the world in terms of those who consume cocaine. Those who consume cocaine, by the way, are largely not black. They're largely not poor. They are the very opposite of that. They are white and upper middle class on the whole. That's the first thing. They consume the product. That's where the demand is. Those who bring cocaine into the country are largely not black and largely not poor. They are men in suits that organise massive transshipment routes, bribe border guards, and can get cocaine from Colombia through the Caribbean, through into Spain or into Amsterdam and into this country. Let's face it, you've got to be seriously organised criminal to pull that off. And how much have you heard about arrests for those sorts of people? So always watch where the public policy attention is. The public policy attention is on getting the young gang member. That isn't going to fix the problem. What's going to fix the problem is the drug question. And of course, I haven't raised issues about public policy in relation to the war on drugs and in relation to decriminalisation, or indeed in relation to regulation or other different ways in which you can deal with drugs as an offending behaviour in society, and therefore which is the best place to do that. Opens up a whole different question, but you could obviously raise those questions. So the point is, stop and search becomes the blunt tool. That's the point. Stop and search becomes the tool by which you stop every black child thinking that they may have a gun, even though the efficacy of the tool is poor. 15% are engaged in criminality of any kind. 85% are stopped multiple times and lose confidence and trust in the police. When you lose confidence and trust in the police, it leads to a culture of no snitching, no telling. You don't trust the police. So you find minority communities have deep distrust for the police. It's this terrible, terrible cycle. And of course, if you don't have trust for the police, you don't tell the police anything. The police don't know anything. They don't know where the drugs are. They don't know they have the intelligence. And therefore, you get larger crime levels. So it's a horrible, horrible, horrible cycle. It's important to understand that it came up in a big way after the London riots in 2011. And actually, at that point, the Conservatives stepped back and changed the rules around stop and search. Theresa May changed the rules around about 2014 on stop and search, brought in far more regulation, far more accountability, until 2019 or 2018, when the rules were changed back because of a spike in knife crime, and the only knee-jerk response to that was to increase stop and search. And so the point is, the efficacy of this doesn't work. The government's own studies show it doesn't work. It's a poor response to the problem at hand. It doesn't just lead to a situation where young people feel criminalised and is brutally unfair. It also creates a situation in which people lack trust in the police and therefore don't use the police, don't go to the police, don't give the police evidence. What does that mean? Well, it means two things. It means that we have a situation where young people are often in police cells and given no comment interviews because they don't trust the police, they don't trust the system. You give no comment interviews. You're ending up in a pipeline to pleading not guilty. You're ending up in the Crown court system. If you're in the Crown court system and then you're found guilty, you're going to get a longer sentence. It all leads to disproportionality. It's the knock-on effect that I started to explore. And this one other point, and this is the point that I raised previously also, in which how can the criminal justice system be particularly pernicious on particular communities? Well, let's take cannabis use. A young man, age 19, sitting in an ivory tower university like Oxford or Cambridge, smoking a joint, No one thinks that that's unusual. No one is surprised by me stating that as a possibility. And guess what? No one's going to call the police, because almost no one thinks it's a criminal act. And it's a gated community anyway. In fact, people might be outraged that you're wasting police time. Another young man, 19, sitting in a housing estate in Salford, he might be white working class, or a black young man sitting in a housing estate just off Cole Harbour Lane in Brixton. He's not in a gated community. He shares the flat in which his mum lives with 3 other brothers and sisters, and it's quite cramped. He steps down the stairwell, he goes to the bottom of the housing estate, and he's having his joint around about the bins, the sort of dustbins at the back of the housing estate. Unfortunately for him, the police walk by or smell the marijuana. Neighbours call the police turn up. Guess what? He gets a criminal record. And he gets a criminal record. It's a pipeline into the criminal justice system. I'm afraid the taxpayers start funding him because a third of people on job seekers allowance have a criminal record. He's then driven into a life of crime effectively because he can't get a job. 2 young people, same age, same community, different attitudes to what the society currently deems a crime. So that's an example of, frankly, institutional responses that are discriminatory within the system.
Thank you for that response, David Lammy. Very important to have him here today in this format. And I think he did a good job of providing insightful comments on the social structures, the institutional development and the individual experiences of policing, and connected it to the Lammy Report for us today. I'm going to introduce our next speaker now to keep the conversation going. And we're very fortunate and privileged today to have Mr. Ian Hopkins, the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. Chief Constable Hopkins also holds the Queen's Police Medal, and you can imagine the pressures on his time. So therefore, we're very pleased to have a senior member of UK policing with us to field some of these questions. Amongst his many hats, Chief Constable Hopkins is also the chair of the MPCC Diversity, Equality and Inclusion Coordination Committee, and he's also a non-executive director of the College of Policing. He's a trustee of the Police Treatment Centres, Cash for Kids and the Michael Carrick Foundation. Ian has also led 6 volunteer programmes to Ethiopia, working with street children and the Ethiopian police. Thanks again for finding time in your busy schedule to be with us today, Chief Constable. I now invite you to offer some of your own thoughts on the conversation started by the Shadow Minister for Justice.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Could I just start by recognising the events that took place in Croydon last week with the horrific murder of Sergeant Matt Rotana. I just think, firstly, our thoughts are very much with Matt, his family, his close colleagues in the Met. But it does highlight the risks that police officers take. We are ordinary citizens that swear an oath to protect our communities, and Matt unfortunately has paid the ultimate price, and in Greater Manchester we only know too well what that means, because the last officers that were shot and killed were 2 of our officers, Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes, in 2012. So our thoughts very much with Matt's family and his close colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to David. And I have to say, I acknowledge and agree with an awful lot of what David has said. And I want to build on some of that and perhaps challenge 1 or 2 of the sweeping statements, not least that you'll get a criminal conviction for smoking marijuana in Salford, where you'll probably more likely to get a cannabis warning, which isn't a criminal conviction. David in particular talked about that pipeline into the criminal justice system and highlighted education and poverty. And I just want to pick up on some of that and maybe add to it. So mixed white and black Caribbean pupils and black Caribbean pupils are 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than white British pupils. And we all know the implications of exclusion from school. It leads to mental health issues. But importantly, figures suggest that more than half the UK prisoners are people who were excluded from school. I wanted to add health inequalities to what David had also talked about, and in particular mental health inequalities as another significant issue in that pipeline. According to the Mental Health Foundation, the risk of psychosis in Black Caribbean groups is estimated to be 7 times higher than the white population, and detention under the Mental Health Act during 2017-18 was 4 times higher for Black or Black British than those in white groups. All of these issues lead to police dealing with society's fault lines on our streets, often in a very public way, because the whole world videos everything that we seem to do at the moment and shares it on social media. So I invite everybody who's joined us tonight to consider a triangle, the base of that triangle being all of those inequalities on which society is built, and the point of the triangle being the police trying to deal with the consequences of those inequalities. Now, I recognise that we have very unique powers and a very unique role in society. You know, we have the powers to take away our fellow citizens' liberty, the power to stop and search a citizen, and the power to use force where necessary and proportionate. And rightly, because of these unique powers, we face unique levels of scrutiny and accountability, arguably being the most scrutinised public service in the UK. And of course, this is fundamental to our legitimacy and policing by consent, which is something that all police officers hold so dearly. So please don't think I'm moaning. The police service also recognises it has to look at what it looks like in terms of reflecting our communities. And David touched on that. And this is something that I've been leading for the police service for 4 years. And we are starting to make progress. It is slow, I have to say. And perhaps that's something we can talk more about later. I also understand the challenges of disproportionality in things like stop search and the use of force. There is a huge focus on police intervention rather than the fundamental building blocks that lead to those interventions. Why? Is it easy to focus on the police? Is it easy to see what the police do? Is it easier to identify specific and individual actions of officers than tackle some of those fundamental building blocks or the pipeline that David talked about? So are we missing a point? Where's the same level of scrutiny around why black pupils are excluded from school and the mental health issues I've spoken about? Now, much of what we have to deal with is incredibly complex. Offenders are also victims and are likely to have been exploited by organised criminals. Offenders are also young and vulnerable. And we are continuing to learn and adapt our policing response. And I think what is absolutely clear to myself and other police leaders is that the more traditional tactics, such as stop search, do have a place when used in an intelligence-led and targeted manner. But there are other interventions which will prove much more beneficial over time. So, for example, in Greater Manchester, the Violent Crime Reduction Unit is working at stopping the inevitable pathway into the criminal justice system. So we have a pilot which is called the Prosecution Intervention and Education and Diversion Scheme. We work in collaboration with Youth Justice, complex safeguarding teams, education, third sector charities who are commissioned to provide interventions along with the local authority through the community safety partnership teams. The objective of this is to increase the opportunities of a child being offered a positive intervention, an education programme or diversion, regardless of statutory thresholds. We identify children who are named as suspects on a daily basis. We build antecedents around these children, and the idea is then to look at them through a trauma-informed lens. The crime event may be low level, but actually when you consider the child's background, there may be evidence of adverse childhood experiences, and actually that child might benefit from a referral to one of our multi-agency safeguarding teams or the youth justice prevention model. The second piece of work that we're doing is aiming to introduce young people to positive interventions through the Greater Manchester Education Protocol, and it gives guidance around what schools should do when a young person has a knife in the school or college. The objective is to ensure that the young person who's found with a knife in school is given the full support of the partnership approach through a commissioned engagement. And because of this, we recognise the value of our officers being given a trauma training and looking at these events through a trauma lens and trying to spot adverse childhood experiences rather than following a traditional criminal justice route. As I said earlier, I do accept the existence of disproportionality in stop search and the use of force, but understanding why is not a simple answer. Disproportionate levels of policing in some of our poorer areas that have more complex needs, higher crime levels, for all the reasons David have mentioned, may be part of the answer. This isn't a reflection of those communities or the individuals living in them, but a reflection of the space that people find themselves in. So what are we doing? As I've said, since 2016, I've led the work in the police service to recruit a workforce that is more reflective. We are making some massive inroads, particularly those from our Asian communities. It remains problematic to recruit people from our black community. The government's Uplift programme has given us an opportunity to really shine a light on those recruitment practices and standardise them and try to drive out some of the inequality that exists in that system, and we are doing that. I launched a toolkit, a workforce toolkit in 2018, and we also agreed a national diversity and equality and inclusion strategy that all police chiefs and police and crime commissioners signed up to. We've just undertaken our first ever national inclusion survey as a service delivered by Durham University independently to shine a light on the culture that exists within the police service, and I will be publishing that within the next week or so. There are some uncomfortable truths in there, but the academics will say that we are no different to other sectors such as health and the society of the UK. We have had peer reviews of police services, we've done self-assessments, and from next year Her Majesty's Inspectorate will be carrying out inspections through the appeal process. Because of the events of this year, we've renewed our energy as National Police Chiefs Council to really focus on the lived experience of our staff and our communities, to really up our community engagement because of the effect that David talked about of the decline of neighbourhood policing through the austerity measures. We really need to build back that community engagement so that people can actually influence policy and decisions and work with us to create better solutions. The one thing that really shines through all of this, though, is our data is incredibly poor when it comes to stop search, use of force, and this is something that we are really trying to work on now to get the accuracy of our data so that we can either explain why there is disproportionality or we can shine a light on it to eradicate it. And that is a big piece of work, as is the workforce data, so that we can track people coming into the service, promotions, progression, people leaving the service, and again, it enables us to put in appropriate interventions. From all of my experience in leading in this area, I think there are two things that the police service have to really focus on. One is leadership, and that's leadership from the top. And if I'm honest, not every leader, not only in policing but in other sectors, are not comfortable in leading in this space and also lack the legitimacy to lead in this space. And I think we have to do something about that. And we also have to bring about cultural change within the service, because that will enable us to bring more people from our ethnic minority backgrounds into policing. And that, for me, will provide a tipping point in terms of how we then respond to our communities. And the Uplift programme that the government have announced is a massive opportunity for us to do that really effectively over the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chief Constable. That was a very informative and personal reflection on the conversation. I'm now going to move into the next speaker and Scarman panelist, who's Dr Suzella Palmer. Dr Palmer is a lecturer in applied social studies at the University of Bedfordshire. Dr Palmer has been teaching at the University of Bedfordshire since 2003 and has taught on a wide range of topics, including social research methods, criminological theory, youth justice, serious youth violence, race, crime and justice at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Beyond her academic role, Dr Palmer has also worked closely with support and to advise a number of community groups and organisations that provide interventions and support for young people and families whose lives are impacted by structural disadvantage and serious youth violence. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Palmer. I now ask you to offer your thoughts on the conversation started by David and Ian.
Thank you so much for inviting me, first of all. Really, really important event. I'm really glad to be a part of this. And I suppose my initial thoughts are very much that I've been here before so many times. I've been doing this for 20 odd years. And, you know, all the research that I've been reading over the last, two or more decades, I'm almost at the point where I'm really kind of disillusioned. So, you know, as much as David Lammy will sort of lay out, what's going on about the differential treatment of BME people within the youth justice or criminal justice system more widely, this is something that academics have known for a very long time. This is nothing new to us. There's nothing new in Lammy's report. It's also sort of brings to mind for me about two very different realities. And so there's the reality that David Lammy talks about, in his explanations for the overrepresentations and differential treatment. But then there's also the reality that people on the ground, people who, young black males in particular, but black communities more generally experience. And it almost seems like two different discourses that are going on, two very different dialogues. And so I'm very aware of that. And so, as I said, there's no real surprises to Lammy's report. I would say that, listening to him tonight and reading his report, I would say that the information that he's putting across falls short on quite a few levels. And so, for example, one of my concerns is that, for example, when we talk about stop and search, we have known for a very long time, nobody's, unaware of this, but, the amount of, or the overrepresentation of young black males in particular who are stopped and searched. But what we don't talk about is the manner in which they're stopped and searched. So, okay, we understand the figures, there's always this representation, but what about the those sort of micro level interactions that happen between, the person who's being stopped and searched? What about the racism? It's a word that I think Lammy doesn't really mention so much, and I think language is really important. There's real power in language. And so when we talk about unconscious bias, it's almost like we're watering down what's, the experience of a lot of these young people that I interview, that I work with on a grassroots level. And so it's the unnecessary and humiliating street searches, for example. I have young people telling me about their experiences, and often it's quite unjustified. And so it's about police abuse of powers within these situations. We hear, tonight I've heard the word accountability mentioned as if accountability is something that actually exists. Okay, and this is when I'm talking about two different discourses that are taking place. So, according to the practitioners, they're accountable. But when you speak to young people on the ground who are on the receiving end of discrimination, racism, they don't see any accountability. David Lammy talked about lack of trust in the police, and he talks about the knock-on effects of that. But until we, until communities, the black community in particular, feel as if police who abuse their power, because it is power that they have, until they feel that the police are able to be held accountable, then we're not really going to make any progress. There's also an issue that I want to raise as well about underreporting, complaints against the police. So there's this kind of, I think, in the public discourse, this impression that policing has improved. The way that the police police black communities have improved. We have these representatives who join police consultative, these people on the ground from the communities who work with the police, get involved in police consultative groups and represent the community. So therefore, these communities are being represented. However, what I found in my research is often these people that sit on these panels do not reflect the views of the people on the ground who are directly affected. And so there's this whole issue around accountability and how people are held to account, and for Black communities or individuals to feel that their issues are being taken on board and that there is some accountability. And so we have this underreporting. So this impression that we have that things have improved, according to my research, they haven't improved. It's just that we don't talk about it anymore. It's not in the public discourse. I remember Black activists got into quite high position, within the London Mayor's office, talking about how things are not as bad as they were in the 80s, when you had the so-called meat wagons and police brutality was such a big deal. I interview young people now where these things are happening still, people being beaten up in police vans and things like that. And, my question to them is always, well, why don't you complain? And their answer is always, well, because, nobody's going to do anything about it. This is just the way things are. And so there's this real resignation, I think, within Black communities, this sense of powerlessness, this sense of, I would say, even defeatist attitude. And I think there's a lot more, I suppose, that I think we need to be doing within our communities, because of this breakdown in trust between the police and communities. There's a lot more that we need to be doing to make sure that these issues are represented and they're not allowed to die down. Every now and again we have a riot, or we have the Black Lives Matter, somebody dies in custody and it becomes on the top of the agenda. And then, after a few months, the trend kind of trickles down. And so, I do feel really frustrated that we keep coming to this point and nothing changes. We had the Scarman Report, we've had the McPherson Report, loads of recommendations, loads of changes in policy. But, for me, it's all window dressing, because what's written down in policy isn't often reflected in practice. And this is where that kind of, that difference that I'm talking about on the ground is really kind of stark. And so I think as well, it's important to look at the kind of systematic, and I think Lammy's covered that, and Ian Hopkins has talked about it as well. We're not just talking about, something that happens within the criminal justice system or within the policing. We're talking about systematic racism, which is a lot more wider. And so I think to tackle this, I'll finish off now with this point, but to tackle this, I think it's not about dealing with, although we do need to look at how, racism manifests itself within different institutions, but I think it's got to be dealt with on a much more kind of, I would even say, global level. I think it's that deep. I think it's that much of a big issue. I think I'll sort of end there.
Thanks so much, Suzella. That was a really insightful way to think about the policy, the institution, the structures, and be real about it. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on, and of course we can come back to talk to Mr. Hopkins and Dr. Palmer during the question and answer. Right now I'm going to introduce briefly Dr. Martin Glynn, who is now our extra third Scarman panelist, not extra, but on the last Scarman panelist with the others, with Dr. Suzella Palmer, sorry. Dr. Glynn is a lecturer in criminology at the Birmingham City School of Social Sciences. He's also a Winston Churchill Fellow with over 35 years experience working in criminal justice systems, public health and educational settings. He's currently a lecturer in criminology at Birmingham City University and is the writer in residence at the National Justice Museum. Dr. Glynn, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to hand over to you now to add your thoughts to the conversation that we're having.
Yes, good evening, everybody. First, I want to say thanks to the University of Leicester. There are certain moments in my life that you wait for, and this is one of them. I turned 63 a few weeks back, and the relevance of it is I've been doing this for over 40 years, and so I'm grateful for Suzella, yourselves, and Ian, because these moments don't happen, and technology's brought us together. I'm going to focus on something different. David is a politician, and politics is only a fragment of policing. It sets the governance, the boundaries, and it doesn't always get it right. I think that Ian has put forward a kind of framework for policing in a progressive way, and Suzella's mapped out a community response. I don't want to do none of that, because otherwise the people watching are going to think, you know, we're recycling. I don't want to do that. I'm going to talk to scholars, I'm going to talk to academics, I'm going to talk to community people, I'm going to talk to my colleagues, and I've got 8 things that I want to share. And I'm just going to talk to give you enough time to get a pen and a piece of paper, because one of the things that gets me about stuff like this, people, after this meeting, everyone's going to say, what did Martin say? What did Suzella say? Well, write it down. So I'm going to give just 8 things. They're not in order of priority. It's not like top of the pops. The first thing I want to say before I get into the 8 is we all have a responsibility. So this is not an us and them. This is all of us. There is an us and them in the way that race is played out within our society, the way that it's socially constructed. But in terms of solutions, it's us and them. You've only got to look at the civil human rights movement, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the struggles in apartheid, across the Caribbean, working class revolutions, the Industrial Revolution. So what I'm dealing with, we've all got responsibilities. So there's nobody that's watching this can say it's nothing to do with me. The only person that can say it's nothing to do with them is COVID-19. So in that sense, it's nothing to do with COVID-19. So the first thing I want to say at universities is we need to actualize students beyond theory. There's far too many courses that are theoretically driven. And I get requests every day, Martin, how can I work in community? How can I do this with the police? And there's some amazing courses. My colleagues are doing some amazing stuff. But as a principal, whether you're training to be a police officer, you need to actualize your relationship as a trainee police officer in community. If you're training to work in criminal justice, so therefore the employability issues are key that need to be channeled through students moving beyond theory. Number 2, staff need to be active in community. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm fortunate, but whether I go shopping at Asda, Tesco, Lidl, wherever I go, I'm always stopped. The way that I built credibility over the last 40 years is because the people see me. They see me going to a chip shop. They see me at a bus stop. They see me jogging in the, first thing in the morning at 6 o'clock. And they'll talk to me and they open up. So I'm suggesting that we need to be more active in community. That's number 2. Number 3, I'm writing a couple of books at the moment around the historical context of Black people in criminal justice, as well as the role of Black arts in criminology. And one of the things that amazes me is that we've got so many academics, but we haven't solved racial disproportionality. We haven't brought it down. So I'm saying to myself, why not? Well, if you study the history of Black scholars, Du Bois was talking about this in the 30s. People have been talking about this for ages, as Suzella said. But the reality of it is, we tend to see, let's regurgitate the problem, as opposed to looking at revising history to find solutions. There are periods in history, whether it's civil rights, human rights, in apartheid. My father was in the 58 race riots in Nottingham. And you might say, well, that was a race riot in August 58. But the reality of it is, my mum had me and I've gone on to get a PhD. That's a positive story. How did I get here? But nobody actually comes and talks to me about how do Black scholars make a difference and actually manage to become Black scholars when we continue to focus on the attainment gap deficit. So what I'm suggesting is call on the work of Black scholars. Not every Black scholar's got a book, but they've got articles, they've got experiences. We shouldn't let them die. So that's one of those things. Number 4 is expand the research agenda. One thing I'd say to Ian in particular, the reason the data is poor is because the vast majority of the difficulties within race and crime, especially when it comes to communities, the qualitative data can't be accessed because the trust is not there. So if we're dealing with research from a policing perspective around policing by consent, you have to get consent. That's what researchers have to do. But if the trust isn't there, you can't get the consent. So what I'm suggesting is expand the research agenda. Every police officer should be a researcher. Every person in public health should be a researcher. Every person in the community should be a researcher when they're talking about the police. We need to be a research society, not armchair socialists who sit shouting at the screen just because we can. Number 5, equip credible messengers with the tools to provide sensitive support. It's not just about violence interruption. Credible messengers are people in the community, faith leaders, youth leaders, teachers, all of those, parents. So therefore, give them the tools. Give them the tools to go out there, spread the word, spread the love, but don't use them as a free resource. I had this many years ago with the police force, who they constantly go to the black community to say, can you help us give up this person? And I say to them, well, how much does a police hostage negotiator get paid? Yet we're asked to do the same thing. So at the end of the day, reward credible messengers. And it's not always about money, but there are credible messengers out there. Number 6, criminology should connect its transformative insights by internationally co-produced ways of learning, teaching and research. I can't believe it. I've traveled around the world and I've been to Johns Hopkins. I've been all over the world, and it's amazing to pick up stuff. But what I don't want to do is just go to America to get a stop and search or a restraint technique. What I want to come back with is solutions. And as far as I'm concerned, having worked in prisons for 4 decades and on the streets, there's loads of solutions. They're in our backyard. They're in the supermarket. They're in the churches. So what I'm suggesting is look across the world. That's why if there's 1,500 people, 2,000 people, swap emails, start to talk to each other on these mediums and find some solutions. Because as a parent and a grandparent and a great-grandparent, I need solutions. I'm getting too old. 7, reframe and revise the historical context. I know, having studied policing historically, that Robert Peel's laws of policing, they were made a long time ago. But I think if you reinvestigated them, try to understand policing by consent. In sexual offences, if a woman says no, it's not by consent. Therefore, it's an illegal offence. When we get stopped and searched and it's not by consent, surely there should be some penalty there. What I'm suggesting is reframe the historical context. And finally, change the messaging. Everybody complains about hip hop, grime, trap, drill. Well, they're spoken about their reality, the way Shakespeare did, the way Charles Dickens did. We don't ban their music. My point of view is maybe what we need to do is get artists involved in a critical solution, the way that I saw with George Floyd, because the moment George Floyd died, the first people to fly into action was graffiti artists, gospel singers, and rap artists. So at the end of the day, they're my 8 things. And they're really about solutions, and they're things for all of you to draw upon. So I've given 8 solutions, and alongside what Ian said, what Suzella said, and David Lammy, and Leicester University by putting this on, if you can't find something in there to do, then as far as I'm concerned, I don't know what you're doing. You must be on permanent lockdown, locked up 23 hours a day in a jail. Because if you're a concerned individual, and I suppose another thing is, amongst the darkness, find some humor. Because it's hard. So listen, that's me done. I'm looking forward to the questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was a really refreshing way to look at the conversation that we're having. And I really particularly like your research society, working together solutions, reinvestigating historical context, those alone, along with the other 8, I would hope that you can post and we can all share them together.
Well, provided people have written them down.
Good. So now we're on to the next and final half hour of the session. So one of the opportunities we have here is to involve the audience. And as you were told at the beginning of everything, we have about 1,500 people signed up today, and from over 30-something countries, including delegates from South Africa, from Australia, from the Caribbean, from parts of Asia, from North America. And today, they get to pose some questions, and what we've done is we've tried to moderate some of those questions, and then we're going to ask our panelists to field the questions and each respond in their own way, building on the conversation that we've been having. And as Nishan, the head of the Leicester University, suggested, we want to try to make knowledge and conversation with each other rather than being in silos, because we're, if we're going to fix these problems, we all need to be on the same team. So the first question that we've selected is actually actually not from too far away. It's from Joe Easterbrook, who's the temporary Chief Inspector of Surrey Police. And I'm going to start this question off by offering it to Chief Constable Hopkins. The question reads, outside of conventional unconscious bias and diversity training, what can forces do to address racial disparity in headline statistics, i.e. around stop and search rates?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you very much from a fellow colleague. So I think the first thing is what I mentioned when I was talking, which is about our data, and it is really poor, and it's poor in a number of ways. So officers not utilising the officer definition of ethnicity correctly, or just not completing it, the self-definition of ethnicity not being appropriately completed, and the grounds for stop search not being appropriately completed. So there is a data quality issue to start with. There's then a macro position that it's very easy to present the figures at a force level, for example. So you say that, you know, this is the number of black or Asian people that are stopped and searched in Greater Manchester, and you do it against the Greater Manchester population, and it looks awful. But actually, within that population, there are communities where the black and Asian minority population is well over 40%. There are other communities where it's as low as 2%. And so we have to really go into those figures and look where the issues are, not look at it at a global scale of Greater Manchester. And from that, we can then start to say, well, is there a problem? Are officers acting outside of the law? Are they not understanding their training? What's the context of the criminality that might be playing out in those communities, so that we can really start to delve into it? So I think there's that whole piece around using the data much better than we have been to explain or to do something about it. I think there's the second thing then is about utilising community figures, and Martin talked about, you know, community figures that have legitimacy within their community, and how he has built that, not somebody who sits on an IAG, but real community figures, using them in the training that we give officers, because I think there's a whole piece around cultural awareness, but also understanding what it is like to be a young black person and to be stopped and searched in front of your fence, and the impact that has on you as an individual, and how that we can do that in a more respectful way, how we can do it in a way that, you know, maintains that trust going forward. And I also think that my final point on this is that there needs to be some publishing the data, but then the independent community members that are part of the scrutiny of that data, so that there is accountability for delivering against some of the things that I've said. So those would be my sort of top three things.
Thank you, Chief Constable. Very informative. Dr. Palmer or Dr. Glynn, would you like to take that question? Offer any thoughts on it? No?
Just very briefly, if you look at road rage, if a car violates another car and the person gets angry and they assault them, it's road rage. Well, if you look at the ecology of a stop and search, you're violating people's space, and it violates to an extent, because of the low rate of detection within stop and search, someone's human rights. So therefore it's a human rights issue. So therefore police need to have an awareness of what somebody's human rights is when they feel powerless, especially when it comes to stop and search at section 60. And I think this is where criminologists and police officers need to get together, because we have the insight. You're out there on the front line, but I'm also out there on the front line talking to people who moan after an aggressive stop and search. I also think, like, when you break the law, you know, if you do speeding, you get 3 points on your license. Well, I think they need to have a similar thing for police officers, that if you have an indiscretion stop and search, so if you do 3 stop and searches badly, there needs to be a point system where, like your driver's license, where you may be taken off active service for a month until you can demonstrate otherwise. Because surely, don't we do that with school children? They get excluded. So I look at it, it's within the governance of the way policing is administered, and not just make the assumption that every person knows how to get on with someone, because police officer training is quite short in terms of, you know, how many of us take years to know about our kids? So what I'm dealing with is, all I'm suggesting is to the police officers out there, you need to invite academics and scholars to have a conversation, a round table, come up with some solutions that are workable and doable, as opposed to recycling the constant pain that I encounter every day with the community.
Thanks, Dr. Glynn. That was very context orientated. Okay, so another question that we've been getting quite a lot of, and it might be one that we don't spend that much time on because we might feel as academics quite obvious, but I think we should really tackle it, is, and this is a question, as I say, that's come from a very large number of people, is why don't more BAME people join the police? And a sort of extension of that question is, why do we think there's maybe underrepresentation at the senior police level as well? Dr. Palmer, would it be okay to offer that question to you here first?
Yeah, I think I can speak on that, and so it goes back to sort of, you know, what I was talking about, that relationship with black communities and the police. So the image of the police is a very poor one, you know, that's held within most black communities. And one of the things that I've been very aware of since, you know, doing this sort of, well, even before doing this research, actually, even being a young black person, you know, growing up in a predominantly black community, is the idea that if you join the police force, because they're seen as an oppressive, you know, oppressive force, you're some sort of a sellout. So by joining the police, you are working, you know, you're going to join an institution that's going to be oppressing your own community. So there's that whole kind of, you know, how can you join the police force and then still fit in, you know, within your community, knowing that this is an issue. And, you know, we're also aware of the racism that exists within the police. And so for a lot of people, it could put them off from joining the police when we hear of, you know, high profile cases where black people have joined the police and then as a result of joining the police have experienced racism within the police force. And so we see when we look at the research, we see that when black people do join the police, you know, the retention isn't for very long. They don't join for very long. You know, they soon experience different types of racism and end up leaving and, you know, finding alternative careers. And so those issues are still there. And I think
can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
One of the things that amazes me is that a lot of black people have just got other things to do. If you assess the goal striving patterns of a lot of black people, some black people want to be a banker, they want to be a scientist, they want to set up a nightclub. And I think that when you look at aspiration is tied to achieving goals. The history of the police force would demonstrate very clearly that the higher you go, the more difficult it is to achieve. And I think that people don't understand that Usain Bolt won 9 gold medals because he trained hard and he achieved the top level in sport. Muhammad Ali was a boxer. So therefore, if you start from the basis of how can I make a difference in society, not every black person wants to make a difference in society to lock people up and arrest people. And I think that the police, and I'm sure Ian probably may have a response to this, but life is like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And as far as I'm concerned, policing is just one thing on the menu. So therefore, it's not that black people don't want to join the police. It's just there's other things that are more attractive, which are important because from my perspective, I've got grandchildren. I've got 5. And they are looking at an economic future. They're trying to look at the economics within the black community. I've got other people around me that are looking at education. So what I'm dealing with is, if we argue that policing is in a competitive, aspirational marketplace, then you need to look at what other things are more attractive doing the same thing. So therefore, I'm just suggesting, rather than see it as a deficit model, I'm suggesting there's a lot of black people out there that have aspirations way beyond law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So I look at it, reframe it, look at what black people want to do. And it's not that I want to join the police. It's just the incentive isn't there because there's other things that people want to do. That's all I'm saying. Is so it's not all doom and gloom, but the police has to sell itself better.
Good point. Chief Constable, can we also offer it to you, maybe to also tackle the senior police part about representation too, please?
Yeah, of course. And you know, it's not true that black and Asian people don't want to join the police, because we are seeing larger numbers than ever before, and particularly from the Asian community. I concur with what Martin's saying about, you know, I talk to my colleagues nationally about we are in a race for talent. We are competing with universities, we're competing with the likes of EY and big banks and all of those sorts of things, and we've got to up our game, and we are doing that in some areas. So the traditional route of everybody coming in at the same level and taking 24 years to get to be an assistant chief constable, because that's the average length of time it still takes to become an assistant chief, are long gone. So Police Now, which is our version of Teach First, 30% of the people joining through Police Now are from Black and Asian minority communities. 50% of them are from women. In my force, we average recruitment is 19% from Black and Asian minority communities. Now, we've done that by sitting down with people, understanding some of the barriers, things like the vetting, some of the fact that it takes longer for them to think about joining the police because they want to talk to their family, they want to talk to their peers. For a long time, our system was, we'd open up a telephone line so that you could apply for an application form. The moment we thought we'd got enough application forms out there for the vacancies, we'd switch it off. And that's great for people like me who might go, yeah, I'm happy to join the police and get on with it, but not for people who, for lots of reasons, want to take a bit longer of thinking about it. So we do continual recruitment and all of those things. We've changed scenarios so that they are not acting in a disproportionate way, and we're getting some really, really good results. At a senior level, in all seriousness, it is awful that we've only ever had one black chief constable. There is an issue that it does take a very long time, and so people just now saying, why aren't the people at the top of the organisation? Well, it is an average of 24 years to get there. Not everybody wants to do it. There are no doubt there are barriers. We see that with female colleagues. We're trying to work through some of those barriers through positive action, equipping people to be able to get to the same place as their white colleagues and then get selected in terms of their talent. And there's a huge amount of work going into that. In my force, I've got one of my assistant chief constables is Asian. I've got a number of chief superintendents and superintendents that are Asian or black or mixed race. And hopefully some of those will start to come through the pipeline. But the pipeline is very narrow at the moment because of the historic problems that we have had in getting that uplift in enough people of colour being in the service in the first place to choose from. So that's going to take some time to wash through. People thought direct entry was going to be the panacea, and it absolutely wasn't. Again, we did well in terms of attracting women, but it did not attract people from Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds. And I think some of the reasons that Martin suggests are absolutely right. And you get paid a lot more going and doing other things than you do being a police officer. That's for sure.
Thank you, Chief Constable. That's keeping it real as well. All right, so I wanted to pick up on that history point that you just mentioned, also to tag back to Martin. Martin, you'd mentioned history, and I know your speciality as well is this well, amongst other things, is this historical lens. What can criminology do better to expose the historical bias in the way we think about race and policing in your mind?
Well, what's interesting to me is I remember when I started my doctorate, and when I was having my ethics committee, they were saying, where's all the white people in your literature review? And I asked everybody, where's all the black people in yours? And they looked at each other and realized it wasn't there. The reality of it is that history is also connected to nationalism, superiority, supremacy. So therefore, reframing history is just about saying, let's have a bit more of a balanced view. Now, in the area of feminism, feminist researchers have done really well by making sure that women are located and embedded. It's an important thing. But black people, it's always the elephant in the room. And so from my point of view, it's not just about people, building trust and giving people that kind of pillow to fall back on, because they've never done it with me. I've never seen a racist apologize for being racist and sparing my feelings. But what I'm dealing with it's who are the history teachers who are presenting that history. To my knowledge, a lot of my white colleagues, if you put it in that context, they will come to people like me because we're going to sit down, have an open conversation, not pose them a threat. I'm not going to fight them over it, but we're going to have a genuine conversation. And to me, what I find amazing, that if we was in the Greek, Roman times, the Underground Railroad, they wouldn't be running away from uncomfortable conversations. So I look at it, maybe this kind of an agenda where, you know, we have a right to free speech, but we also legally have the right to offend. We also have the right to speak rhetorically. And I just think that one of the things with history, and what I love is, I'm an anorak when it comes to history. So when I trundle out black facts, I remember one I came across recently when it said the first black police officer was in 1930 or 40. No, it wasn't. It was in the north. It was in the northeast of England in the 1800s. And the reality of it is, how do I find out? Because I'm a good researcher. So I look at it as a good researcher. I'm supposed to find out stuff that nobody knows. Hence, you contribute to knowledge. So therefore, I would say, how accountable are some scholars? I believe that I think that historians write about crime better than criminologists write about history. So therefore, what I'm suggesting is, maybe it's not about the 4-star journal. Maybe it's not about, you know, the next grant that you put in. Maybe it's actually spending some time looking in the past and then coming back and saying, you know something, yeah, we need to reframe, because a lot of the stuff I read is inaccurate when it comes to the portrayal of race and diversity. We've been here from 55 BC. We helped build Hadrian's Wall. We were the court of Henry VIII. That's relevant when it comes to the perception that now lingers about disproportionality, because it's rooted within history. If I was a person talking from Ghana, the Caribbean, South America, history is a foundation in which you look at law and criminal justice. I just want to use one example. During the Battle of Waterloo, there was a guy called Sir Thomas Picton, very famous general, stood alongside Wellington. Great. But he also was found guilty in the British court of torturing a slave girl, Louisa Calderon, in Trinidad. What's the relevance of that? In the history books, it shows this. He was probably a great general, but the fact is, he was found guilty by Thomas Garrow of torturing a slave girl. What does that mean? What that means is you have to look at the individual in a very different way, as opposed to they've got they're heroic. They're heroic on the battlefield, but yet they tortured someone. So I look at it, talk to black scholars, because what we have to do all the time is contest the history of white oppression so that everybody can feel it's more balanced. So I would say every criminologist needs to become a historian and make sure that you pass that on to people like the police so they understand, because I meet an amazing amount of police who don't know the history of policing. I'm thinking to myself, what are they learning? You know, I mean, imagine going to an NHS doctor and he says, well, I don't know anything about strokes or heart attacks. You'd be horrified. So I'm saying, if you're a custodian of the law, you owe it to the community to at least understand the historical context for your behavior, attitudes, thoughts, beliefs, and history.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, 100% agree on the importance of this historical context and the power it can give to people to better understand where they are in the present and where they've come from. I've got another kind of slightly tangential question, not really about history, more about culture, that's been posed by Dave Turner at the Open University, and it's open for all, so I wasn't going to direct it at any one of you, so I was hoping for a volunteer here. And the question goes, what will be done differently in the context of cultural change that Scarman review, the Scarman and Lawrence inquiries have failed to address? So this is more about a cultural change kind of angle on the problematic. Would anybody like to venture a comment on it?
I'll do it very quickly, then pass it over to Suzella. Culture is embryonic. It's constantly shifting and changing. You know, when I was growing up, it was Motown, James Brown. Now we've got Stormzy, Wiley. We've got grime, trap, drill. We've got different types of fashion. It's embryonic, it's changing. And I think that, again, I'm going to go back to my original point. If you're really on the pulse of community, you need to see how that embryonic change plays out, because that culture is the custodian of the historical past and the move towards the future. So to me, it's about getting out there and understanding first what the culture is. And then once you understand what the culture is, what do you want to do with it when you find out? So for me, once again, as academics, we need to be out in the streets talking to people, whether it's a rural community, a suburban community, but culture's embryonic. Read Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall, he talked to us about that. He talked to us about how it's shifting and changing, and it changes over time. So all I'm suggesting is study those scholars, who have talked about this, but they've been put on second-hand bookshelves. Suzella.
Yeah, totally agree. And it is about the culture, I suppose, British society more widely. But I would say if we're looking at police culture, we used to call it canteen culture, didn't we? Police culture. And we look at, for example, sexism and racism, how that was really integral to police culture for a long time. And I would say, as Ian Hopkins did say earlier, when it comes to sort of recruitment of more female officers, that's been quite positive. That's something that's definitely been happening. And I think to some extent, having more females within the police could do something to shift, the culture of sexism that's embedded within the police, maybe not as much. But when it comes to issues around race and racism within the police and other criminal justice institutions, when it comes to trying to change police culture in that aspect, we could arguably say the recruitment then of more black officers, more BME officers from BME background, could to some extent help to address that. Although I'm just never optimistic about these things. As I said, I've been here before. And there are examples where, for example, in America, where they have had the positive discrimination, in order to make sure that more people are recruited into the police. And, part of the idea behind that was that you would do something to, impact the police culture. Whereas actually, when you look at the research, it didn't quite work. Because what you're doing is you're recruiting people into a culture that's already established, a particular way. And I think this is where I suppose education would come into it, and the training. And I'm not talking about short training programs. I'm talking about making sure that we have more people that are recruited in the police who really do have much more fundamental knowledge, actually, about things like discrimination within the police, discrimination within wider society, understanding of whiteness and how that impacts, on the way that I suppose people behave, understand the dynamics of racism on a much more deeper level. And it does take, I think years of training and experience to be able to do that. So I think there's something in terms of recruiting officers with, that are able to bring, I suppose, that awareness and then effect that cultural change once they're in there.
Could I say something to Ian? Because I think in terms of police culture, I thought you were talking about general culture. Ian, I sat next to Lord Scarman when the report came out. And I remember when it came out because I was an activist in London at the time. To my knowledge, only about 3 or 4 recommendations that he made have ever been implemented. Likewise with Stephen Lawrence. There's nothing to stop you and your colleagues taking the Scarman inquiry and the Stephen Lawrence and the Lammy review. But what you find is there's very little commitment to implement the recommendations that have been made, because they argued for a shift in police culture. But what happens is discretion plays the better part of how things happen. So therefore, unless chief superintendents and politicians are really into the implementation phase of a policy cycle, then all that happens, you recycle the argument. So I would suggest give all your officers a copy of Scarman's recommendations. And if you implemented those, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I'm going back to history. In the last 40 years, there's probably been about 1,000 recommendations on policing made. And if I can cite probably 20 that have ever been implemented badly, so I look at it, study your history, and you'll find, let's look at policing by consent. That's a great recommendation, but that was done in the 1800s. Is it working? No, but it should be, because it should be applied. So I'm saying applied policing is apply what's gone before, as opposed to another report. You don't need it. You just need to apply what's gone before. So I'm saying it to you because I'm not going to speak to your colleagues. You will after this meeting. And I'm just saying, get the reports, read them and say, let's do this.
Okay, thanks, Mike, because we're running out of time.
Okay.
Chief Constable, would you like to respond at all to any of that culture change question?
I absolutely would. So in some ways, I agree with the historical context. In fact, chiefs, we were discussing it earlier in the year that bringing new recruits in and the training that they go through, there is no historical input. And actually, we've got people joining because of their tender years compared to most of us on this call this evening. I've not heard of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson inquiry. And, so I'd sort of go back to Martin and say, things have been implemented, but the tide of time means that they get forgotten and then they need to be revisited. And I think that's the bit that we've got to do, and we need to create space. We also need to. One of the challenges I put into the College of Policing this year was that the sergeants and the inspectors exam, which are two iconic moments in people's career that are looking for progression, do not test you in relation to the equality legislation. They do not test you in relation to making a disclosure in the public interest, but they test you about the Badgers Act and how to report a road traffic collision and all of those sorts of things. And actually, these are the people that we're equipping to go and lead our frontline teams that can have an impact on cultural change. So we need to make some systematic changes around some of those iconic things within the service. I agree with Dr. Palmer, there is research, particularly when it comes to gender, that if you get to 30% of your organisation, it creates a tipping point in a shift in culture. Now, we've gone past that for female officers. Nationally, it's about 33%. Some forces are about 40%. Others are just below the 30%. So you have seen a softening of that sort of what Dr. Les Graham from Durham, who's done my National Inclusion Survey stuff for me, would describe as a robust culture within policing. You've certainly seen a softening of that because of more female colleagues coming in. What there isn't, and this is my challenge back to the academics, is there is very little research to say what is the tipping point when it comes to ethnicity. And I would be very interested in understanding what that is. But we are bringing more people in, and in one ways that helps to shift the culture because things like understanding of Ramadan and the implications of that for colleagues and all of those sorts of things start to get built into our systems. But it does create other issues as well. So, we get challenges from LGBT networks that some of the people that are coming in that have religious beliefs that are contrary to recognising people that, in same-sex relationships. So it is a multifaceted culture that we're trying to deal with currently.
Okay, guys, we are getting close to the end, so I'm going to have to try to tie this up in the next 3 minutes. So I was going to ask you each if you could speak for maybe just 1 minute to answer the big question that the panel was really about, and this is the relationship between race, policing and criminology. So specifically, what do you think criminologists and, for Ian, criminologists and the police need to do together to deal with some of the issues that we've been speaking today about? Dr. Glynn, would you like to go first?
Basically, just be proactive, engage, talk, discuss, argue, but come to some kind of consensus, because the one thing that's important is the safety of communities. And if we're all agreed on that, we just have to look at different mechanisms from which to do it. So for me, come together, work together, play together, argue together, and make that change.
Build the research society. Dr. Palmer, could I ask you for your couple of points in closing?
I think for criminologists, get out of those ivory towers and start, interacting with people on the ground. I think that's really, really important. Unfortunately, this black stuff doesn't pay the bills. And so, the opportunity to do the research that Ian Hopkins is talking about, that money isn't necessarily there. The funding isn't necessarily there. If I wanted to do research on, drugs and young black males, there's plenty of money out there for that type of research. If I wanted to do research on looking at interactions, between black communities and police, that funding isn't there. And I would also say that, the majority of criminologists are white. And I would say, check yourself, reflect yourself, look at how you are actually contributing to the problem, because you haven't sort of done that groundwork.
Thanks, Dr. Palmer. Chief Constable, what would your hopes of working with criminologists be to change some of these questions and problems?
I think we can learn a lot from each other. I think that, and I love my academic colleagues, and we do work with our local universities on a number of things, but I work to very different timescales and political pressure and, very short-termism sort of objectives. And I think often, academic research it takes too long to be able to wash through into practice. And if we could shorten that gap, I think that would be beneficial to all of us.
Thank you so much for that final thoughts and comments. So I just wanted to thank, all our presenters today, David Lammy, Ian Hopkins, Suzella Palmer, Martin Glynn, and also I'd like to thank all the audience for taking their time to, listen to the conversation. I want you to all to continue the conversations, make the connections, build this research society, work together for solutions. I think in this pandemic sense, everybody, you need to be kind to yourselves too, and remember we're all on the same side to try to overcome these problems. And for this year, for the Scarman, that is a wrap. And thank you all for taking part. And we really appreciate your time and giving your thoughts today. Thank you.